I've lived in this apartment for about 5 years now. It's nothing fancy, just your average complex with paper-thin walls, drafty windows, and neighbors you rarely see but can definitely hear. For the most part, it's quiet. People mind their own business, and I do the same. I work from home, which has its perks, but also means I'm hyper-aware of the noise around me. You notice every little sound when you're home all day. That's where the trouble with Tanya started. Tanya moved in about a year ago, and from day one, it was clear that she wasn't the type to live a quiet life. She's in her late 20s, and I'm sure she's just having fun, living life to the fullest or whatever people call it. At first, it was just the occasional loud music, nothing too disruptive. But it wasn't long before I realized that the music was the least of my problems. The real issue began when her nighttime activities started. I don't know if she was single when she first moved in, but it didn't take long before she had a steady stream of late-night visitors. And by late night, I mean every night at exactly 10 p.m., like clockwork. Her and her partner, or partners, I'm not really sure, would engage in the loudest, most over-the-top, dramatic sessions I've ever had the displeasure of hearing. It wasn't just the usual sounds you might expect from thin walls. This was next-level stuff. Screaming, moaning, thumping, bed frame squeaking, the works. It started to become a nightly ritual. I would sit down in my living room to watch TV or listen to music, and within minutes, the noises would start. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'm not a prude, and I don't care what people do in their private lives. But when your private life is so loud that it drowns out everything in the next apartment, it becomes everyone's problem. I tried everything to block out the noise. I turned up the TV. I put on my noise-canceling headphones. I even moved to the other side of the apartment, but nothing worked. The walls were too thin, and Tanya's activities were too loud. Every night, it was the same thing. Just when I thought I might get a quiet evening, the moaning and thumping would begin. After a couple of weeks of this, I decided to take action. I started by knocking on the wall during their sessions, hoping that would at least signal to Tanya that she was being a little too loud. It didn't work. If anything, it seemed like the noises got louder after that. Then I left a polite note on her door, explaining the situation and asking if she could maybe keep it down at night. The next day, she saw me in the hallway, laughed it off, and said, "We're just having fun," like it was no big deal. I figured I'd give it some time, thinking maybe she'd get the message, but nothing changed. Every night, it was the same. I even tried talking to her again when I bumped into her in the hallway a second time. I brought it up casually, trying not to make it awkward, but she just waved it off again, saying, "Oh, we're just having fun. It's not that loud." I don't know how she didn't realize that the entire building could probably hear what was going on, but she clearly didn't care. After a few more weeks of sleepless nights, I'd had enough. I knew going to the landlord was an option, but I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the one who tattled on his neighbors like some bitter old man. So, I decided to fight noise with noise. If Tanya was going to make my evenings unbearable, I was going to do the same for her. That's when I came up with the whale mating calls idea. It started as a joke, something I mentioned to a friend when I was venting about the situation. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a perfect solution. I went online and found a playlist of whale mating calls, deep, haunting, eerie sounds that could easily drown out any other noise. I set up my speakers right next to the wall we share, ready for battle. The first night I tried it, I waited for the usual 10 p.m. noises to start. Sure enough, right on schedule, the thumping and moaning began. I hit play on the whale sounds and cranked up the volume. The low, drawn-out calls filled my apartment, and for the first time in weeks, I couldn't hear Tanya and her partner over the sound of the whales. It was surreal, hearing these eerie whale sounds mixed with the distant moans and thumps from next door. But it worked. It completely drowned out the noise, and after a few nights, I even started to find the whale sounds relaxing. It didn't take long for Tanya to notice. A few nights after I started playing the whale calls, she came over to my apartment, looking annoyed. She asked me what the noise was and why it was so creepy. She said it was messing up their vibe, whatever that means. I calmly told her that I was trying to create a calming atmosphere in my apartment, and that the whale sounds helped me relax. It wasn't technically a lie, I had grown to like the sound of the whales. She didn't seem convinced, though, and stormed off without saying much else. After that, things escalated. Tanya started threatening to go to the landlord about the noise. She said that my whale sounds were disturbing, and that I was doing it on purpose to ruin her evenings. She wasn't wrong about that last part, but I wasn't going to admit it. I told her the whale sounds helped me relax, and if she had a problem with it, she could talk to the landlord. I didn't think she'd actually do it, but then again, I didn't think she'd be blasting her nightly activities loud enough for the entire building to hear, either. Now I'm stuck in this weird limbo. Tanya's still making noise every night, but now I've got my whale mating calls to drown it out. It's become a kind of bizarre ritual, her moaning and thumping on one side of the wall, my wails on the other. I know it's not a permanent solution, but it's working for now. The question is, am I the asshole for doing it? Part of me thinks I should have just gone to the landlord and let them handle it. But another part of me feels like Tanya brought this on herself by ignoring my polite requests. At the end of the day, I don't know if I'm in the wrong here. I'm just a guy trying to live in peace in an apartment where the walls are way too thin. I didn't ask for Tanya's nightly activities to become part of my life, and I certainly didn't ask for the sleepless nights that came with them. All I wanted was a little quiet, and when I couldn't get that, I found another way to cope. If Tanya goes to the landlord, I guess I'll deal with that when it happens. Maybe they'll tell me to stop playing the whale sounds, but maybe they'll also tell her to keep it down. At this point, I'm not sure what the outcome will be, but I'm ready to fight for my right to some peace and quiet, whale mating calls and all. In the meantime, I'll keep playing the whale sounds. They've become part of my nightly routine, and honestly, they help me sleep better than I ever expected. If Tanya and her partner can keep doing their thing at full volume, then I don't see why I can't play a few soothing whale calls to help me relax. Am I the asshole for handling it this way? Maybe, but after weeks of sleepless nights and ignored requests, I feel like I'm just doing what I have to do to get by. It's not like I asked for this situation, and I've done my best to deal with it in a way that doesn't involve calling in the landlord or escalating things further. For now, the whales and I will keep coexisting with Tanya and her nightly activities, and I'll keep finding peace in the deep, haunting calls of the ocean.
We were both 23, and Tom and I had been dating for a little over a year and a half. Things were pretty solid between us, or at least I thought they were. He was between jobs at the time, having been laid off from his previous one. It wasn't his fault, the company downsized, and he was one of the unlucky ones. Ever since then, he'd been searching hard for something new. I knew he was trying, sending out resumes, going on interviews. I supported him the best I could, believing that he'd land on his feet soon enough. Then his lease ran out at his apartment. Apparently, the complex decided to do an income recheck for lease renewals, which wasn't something I'd ever heard of before, but I guess it's rare and unlucky, just like everything else that had been happening to Tom. He couldn't renew the lease without a job, so he asked if he could move in with me temporarily. We'd talked about moving in together eventually, maybe sometime next year, so it didn't seem like a big leap to let him stay with me while he figured things out. I didn't see the harm in it. I cared about him, and it felt like the right thing to do. After all, we were serious, and if the plan was to move in together eventually, why not let him stay now while he was in a tough spot? It wasn't supposed to be forever, just until he got back on his feet. So, I said yes. He moved his things in, and for a while, everything seemed fine. We had our routines, and nothing felt too different. This past summer, I'd been experimenting with my style. I'd always been someone who dressed pretty conservatively, even when it was hot outside. Long sleeves, long pants. It was just how I felt most comfortable, mostly because I used to be insecure about my body. But I'd been trying to break out of that shell. I started wearing things like cropped tops, sleeveless shirts, miniskirts, and short shorts. It was nothing too revealing, but it was definitely a change from my usual covered-up style. It felt good. It felt freeing. When I first started dressing this way, Tom was nothing but supportive. He knew about my insecurities, how I used to hide behind layers of clothes even in the heat of summer. He encouraged me to embrace my body and wear what made me feel good. His support helped me become more comfortable in my own skin, and I appreciated that. It felt like he was on my side, rooting for me to become more confident. But a few days ago, something changed. Out of the blue, Tom told me he thought it was time for me to start covering up again. It caught me completely off guard because he'd been so supportive before. Now, suddenly, he was saying he didn't like the way I was dressing. He said he thought my new style made it seem like I was available, that other guys would think I was open to their advances. It was a complete shift from everything he'd said before. I told him that I wasn't dressing for other guys. I was dressing for myself, for my own confidence, and to feel good around my friends. If some random guy thought I was available just because of the clothes I was wearing, that was his problem, not mine. Besides, it wasn't like I was encouraging anyone. I wasn't looking for attention from men, and I wasn't interested in any advances. I was just living my life. But Tom didn't see it that way. He said it was my responsibility to dress in a way that wouldn't make guys want to approach me. As if it was somehow my job to prevent unwanted attention by changing the way I presented myself. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was coming from the same man who had encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone and embrace my body. Now he was telling me that by doing so, I was inviting trouble. It felt like he was blaming me for something that hadn't even happened. Then he took it further. He said that if I liked the feeling of attention from other men, it was a sign that I was disloyal. He made it sound like my confidence, my enjoyment of wearing clothes that made me feel good, was some kind of betrayal. Like I was secretly seeking validation from other men, even though I was in a committed relationship with him. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, stunned. Tom eventually walked away, leaving me to process what had just happened. The next day, I made a decision. I told him that we were done. I couldn't be with someone who tried to control what I wore, who made me feel like my self-expression was a threat to our relationship. I told him I wanted him out of the apartment immediately. That's when things got messy. Tom started crying. He said he had nowhere to go. He told me that if I kicked him out, he'd have to burn through the last of his savings staying in hotels. He made it sound like I was heartless for asking him to leave when he was in such a vulnerable position. But I stood my ground. I told him that he should have thought about that before trying to control what I wear. I wasn't going to back down. I didn't feel bad about ending the relationship. That decision was clear to me. But kicking him out? That part made me hesitate. He was in a tough spot, and I knew it. But at the same time, I didn't want to let him stay in my space after what had happened. I needed to reclaim my own boundaries, my own sense of self. I couldn't live with someone who saw me that way, who thought they had the right to dictate how I dressed and acted. Later, Tom texted me. He said he was okay with the breakup, but he called me an asshole for kicking him out when he needed help. That made me question myself. Was I too harsh? Should I have let him stay until he figured something out? I didn't regret breaking up with him, but I started to wonder if kicking him out immediately was the wrong move. I kept thinking about it. Was I being cold-hearted? Should I have given him more time to find a place? But then I remembered the way he had tried to control me, the way he had turned something as simple as clothing into a statement about my loyalty. That wasn't something I could ignore. I didn't want to be in a relationship where my choices were constantly scrutinized, where I was expected to change who I was just to keep someone else comfortable. In the end, I stood by my decision. It wasn't easy, and part of me still felt bad about the way things ended. But I knew I had to protect myself, my sense of self-worth, and my boundaries. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even someone I cared about, make me feel like I had to hide who I was. I had spent too long building my confidence to let it be torn down by someone else's insecurities. Maybe I could have handled things differently. Maybe I could have given Tom more time to figure out his living situation. But when it came down to it, I realized that I needed to put myself first. It wasn't about being cruel or uncaring. It was about taking care of my own well-being. I had to make the choice that was best for me, even if it wasn't the easiest one. So, was I the asshole for kicking him out? I don't think so. I did what I had to do to protect myself, to draw a line and say enough is enough. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing to do, choosing yourself when someone else is trying to make you feel guilty for it. But in the end, I knew it was the right choice.
I tell my son that someone hurt his mom when she was little without her permission. I'm 36, and I married my college sweetheart. We've built a life together, a good life, with 3 kids. Our sons are 6 and 3, and our daughter is just shy of 6 months. We had what I thought was a solid routine: work, family, the usual ups and downs. But since our daughter was born, things have changed, and not in ways I could have predicted. My wife, let's call her Emma, has always been open with me about her past. She had a difficult childhood. She was sexually abused by an older relative, and when she finally came forward, her family didn't support her. That kind of betrayal shaped her in deep ways, and she hasn't spoken to her parents or her two older brothers in years. They weren't the kind of people you'd want around anyway. Emma did everything she was supposed to do after the abuse. She filed a police report, she went to therapy, she worked on herself. For years, she kept it all in check. She has PTSD and depression, but it's been manageable, or at least, it seemed to be. When our daughter was born, something shifted. At first, I chalked it up to the usual adjustment period that comes with a new baby. Sleep deprivation, hormonal changes, all the typical things. But it wasn't just that. Emma didn't seem to bond with our daughter the way she did with our sons. I could tell something was off. She wasn't her usual, cheery self, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Then, about 4 months after our daughter was born, Emma told me she'd been having terrible nightmares. She said she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to her as a child. Her mind was stuck, replaying it, and she was terrified that something similar could happen to our daughter. She felt hopeless, like she couldn't protect her. I tried to help her, but nothing I did seemed to ease her fears. The breaking point came about a month ago. I came home from work, and I found Emma lying on the bathroom floor, sobbing. She was clutching a bottle of pills, saying she wanted to die. That moment was like a punch to the gut. I had no idea things had gotten that bad. I called 911 immediately, and she was taken to the hospital. They kept her there for about a week. Thankfully, the kids were with my mother when it happened. Emma would never have let them see her like that. I know that for sure. But while Emma was in the hospital, I was left to hold things together for our kids. Our youngest two were too little to understand what was going on, but our oldest, our 6-year-old, was confused and upset. He's sensitive, and he's always been incredibly close to his mom. He kept asking where she was, why she wasn't home, and why she was sad. I tried to reassure him, telling him the doctors were helping her feel better, but it didn't seem to be enough. One night, when he asked again why his mom was so sad, I panicked. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't prepared for that question. So, I told him the truth, at least, a version of it. I said that when his mom was little, a grown-up did some bad things to her, and that made her sad sometimes. He didn't understand what that meant, so I explained that someone had touched her in places that weren't appropriate, and that's why she was sad now. My son didn't ask any more questions after that. He seemed to accept my answer, and for the time being, I thought I had done the right thing. I hadn't gone into detail, I hadn't said anything too graphic, but I had given him an explanation that felt honest. At the time, it seemed like the best way to calm him down, to help him make sense of why his mom wasn't home. When Emma came back from the hospital, she was doing better. She felt terrible about what had happened, about how things had spiraled. We both know postpartum depression played a big role in all of this, especially with our daughter being her first girl. It brought up a lot of trauma she thought she had dealt with. But she's doing everything she's supposed to do, therapy, medication, the works, and I'm incredibly proud of her. She's making a huge effort, not just for herself but for our kids. Then yesterday, everything came to a head. Our oldest son had been at a birthday party, and by the time he got home, he was overtired from all the sugar and excitement. He was throwing a tantrum, crying about who knows what, and Emma asked him what was wrong. That's when he blurted out that he was sad because someone did bad things to her when she was little. Emma was confused, and I had to explain the conversation I had with him while she was in the hospital. Emma wasn't happy, to say the least. She was furious, actually. After she calmed our son down and told him that everything was okay, she turned to me. She said she never wanted our kids to know about what happened to her, especially not when they're this young. She was angry that I'd told him without talking to her first, and she made it clear that she didn't think he needed to know anything about her past. I tried to explain my side. I didn't know what else to say at the time. Our son was upset, and I was the one who had to deal with his questions. Emma was in the hospital. It wasn't like I could ask her permission before answering. And it's not like I told him every detail. I kept it as vague and child-friendly as possible. But that didn't seem to matter to her. In her eyes, I had crossed a line. Looking back, maybe I should have found another way to explain her absence. Maybe I could have said something else, something less specific. But in the moment, I was trying to help our son understand why his mom was gone, why she was sad, and why things weren't normal. I thought being honest, even in a simplified way, was the right thing to do. Now, I'm left wondering if I made the wrong call. Emma thinks I did. She feels betrayed, like I exposed something that wasn't mine to share. I didn't mean to hurt her, and I certainly didn't want to make our son worry about her more than he already was. But at the time, I didn't know what else to do. I was alone with the kids, trying to keep everything together while Emma was getting the help she needed. Part of me feels like I was just doing my best in a tough situation. But another part of me understands why Emma is so upset. Her past is her own, and maybe it wasn't my place to tell our son about it. But what was I supposed to do when he kept asking why she was so sad? I didn't want to lie to him. I didn't want to brush it off like it didn't matter. In the end, I'm not sure if I did the right thing. I'm not sure if I should have handled it differently. All I know is that I was trying to protect both my wife and my son in that moment. I didn't want to add to Emma's burden, but I also didn't want to leave our son in the dark, confused and scared about why his mom wasn't home. Maybe there was no perfect answer. Maybe, in situations like this, you just have to do the best you can with what you've got. Emma and I still haven't fully resolved this. She's still upset, and I understand why. But I hope she can see that I wasn't trying to hurt her or undermine her privacy. I was just trying to navigate a difficult situation the best way I knew how. Whether or not I handled it the right way is something I'm still grappling with.